Yummy. Hey everybody, in this episode of the Basket Case BMW project, we continue the rehab work. I'm happy to say this is the last episode in the rehab series. So after this, we can start doing some fun stuff with the car. But I want to make sure most of the maintenance issues are taken care of before doing mods and making upgrades. The first thing we'll tackle in this video is the valve cover gasket. The engine had several vacuum leaks. I found and fixed all the other common vacuum leaks, but the engine still acted like it had a vacuum leak. When I looked at the valve cover, I noticed most of the valve cover bolts, and the grommets for them, were missing. Also, when I removed the valve cover, I noticed there were blobs of silicone sealant randomly placed all over the valve cover gasket. I'm not sure why anyone would do this. So I went to the salvage yard and grabbed a bunch of valve cover bolts. I also ordered a valve cover gasket set. This one has the spark plug hole gaskets and the rubber grommets for the valve cover bolts. I also had to scrape all the silicone residue out of the valve cover. I did that off camera because I didn't think that would be very interesting to watch. Okay, let's install the new valve cover gasket. First I installed the rubber grommets onto the valve cover bolts. They have to go on a certain way. One side of the grommet is stepped and the other side is flat. The step needs to be facing down. Next, we put the gasket into the valve cover. It's designed to fit into the groove in the valve cover. No glue or sealant is needed. The spark plug hole gasket is basically the same. No glue or sealant needed. Just press it on. Here's what the gasket should look like after you install it into the valve cover. Now it's time to install the valve cover. Before I installed it, I cleaned the mating surface on the cylinder head with brake cleaner. I also installed the studs for the valve cover bolts. And I put a small dab of sealant on the seam where the Vanos unit meets the cylinder head. You don't need much sealant there, just enough to fill that little gap. Now we can start installing the valve cover bolts. I decided to install the ones in the middle of the valve cover first. Then I installed the ones around the outside. It took a while to snug down all the bolts. They're pretty small and you can easily break them if you're not careful. The valve cover is installed. Now we can reinstall everything else. First I'll clip the O2 sensor wiring and the ignition coil wiring back into place. Then I'll install the three 8mm nuts for the ground wires. Then I'll install the ignition coils. last but not least, we'll reinstall the oil fill cap and the breather tube. Next order of business is the gauge cluster. I talked about this in a previous video, but it took some time to resolve the issue. I read some comments online about rebooting the gauge cluster, replacing capacitors and stuff. Of course, I checked the fuses first. I tried the various methods people use to reboot the gauge cluster, but nothing worked. So I ordered some capacitors to replace the ones on the circuit board. When I took the gauge cluster apart, I noticed the capacitors were leaking onto the circuit board. I also noticed there was some corrosion on some of the circuit traces. I decided to replace the capacitors and see if that helped. It made no difference. I also tried cleaning the corrosion from the circuit traces. That didn't help either. But just for future reference, here are the capacitors I bought. They're electrolytic capacitors. The circuit board has one big one and two of the smaller ones. I finally gave up on resurrecting the gauge cluster and decided to find another one in the salvage yard. Luckily, I was able to find one pretty easily. But the big question is, does it work? I won't know until I take it home and install it. Cross your fingers. Yes! Let's savor the moment. Next, I wanted to check the drive belts and the belt-driven accessories. The main drive belt seems okay. There aren't any cracks and it isn't worn out yet. However, the AC belt is starting to crack. But I'm not worried about that because the AC will probably be deleted anyway. However, this caught my attention. The power steering pulley was damaged. I found a replacement at the salvage yard. To get at the drive belts, I had to remove the clutch fan. When I removed it, I found this. It's a good thing I caught that because eventually that fan would come apart and cause a bunch of damage. I don't like clutch fans anyway, so I'm going to replace it with an electric fan. And on that bombshell, we'll end this episode of the Basket Case BMW project. Thanks for watching.